On June 22, 1941, German troops, as well as the armies of Hitler's Germany's allies, crossed the border of the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War began. Meanwhile, even a few years before it began, German propaganda was actively preparing the population of the Third Reich for aggression against the Soviet Union. Anti-Soviet myths and strains were replicated by the powerful propaganda apparatus of Hitler's Germany. The task was simple: to form in the average German the idea of the Soviet Union as a terrible, barbaric country, which was on the lowest stage of cultural development and threatened Europe and European culture. And it must be said, this task of propaganda turned out quite well. However, from the first days of the war, soldiers and officers of the German armies began to realize that the propaganda, to put it mildly, exaggerated the horrors of life in the Soviet Union, poverty and uncultured Soviet people. The longer the Germans stayed on the territory of the USSR, occupying Belarus, Ukraine and the Baltic states, the more the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht became convinced that the propaganda was lying. In the stories of the official German press about life in the Soviet Union, about the Red Army, about the Russian people, the German soldiers were disappointed in several ways at once. Thus, German propaganda actively spread the myth about the low combat effectiveness of the Red Army, the cowardice of Soviet soldiers and their unwillingness to obey commanders. But the first months of the war showed that this was far from true. Blitzkrieg failed, and the fact that we had to face a very strong and serious opponent, the German soldiers and officers realized already during the Battle of Moscow. Naturally, in the first days of the war, almost all soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht were convinced that the Soviet Union can be defeated and conquered without much difficulty. After all, the Wehrmacht had no problem coping with the numerous and strong French and Polish armies, not to mention the armed forces of other European countries. But the Battle of Moscow made total adjustments to the ideas of Hitler's soldiers about their enemy. Hans Becker, a soldier of the 12th Panzer Division, recalled, "On the Eastern Front I met people who could be called a special race. Already the first attack turned out to be a battle not for life, but for death." The soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht were amazed by the Red Army soldiers who fought to the last man. Even burned alive, left without a leg or arm, bleeding, Russian soldiers continued to fight. Until the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans had not encountered such resistance anywhere. Of course, in other European countries there were feats of military service, but in the Soviet Union heroism was shown by almost every soldier. And this delighted or frightened the German soldier at the same time. It is easy to understand the feelings of a Wehrmacht soldier or officer when he encountered Russian soldiers who fought to the last man, ready to blow themselves up with a grenade along with the surrounding opponents. One of the officers of the 7th Panzer Division recalled, "You simply cannot believe such a thing until you see it with your own eyes." Soldiers of the Red Army, even being burned alive, continued to shoot from burning houses. The courage of Soviet soldiers dispelled the myths of Goebbels' propaganda machine. German soldiers wrote in their diaries, in letters home, that they could not imagine such an outcome of the military campaign in Russia. It was not only the privates, non-commissioned officers and junior officers of the Wehrmacht who recognized the fallacy of the notion of a quick victory. Generals were no less categorical. Major General Hoffmann von Waldau, who served in a high command position in the Luftwaffe, emphasized, "The quality level of Soviet pilots is much higher than expected. Fierce resistance, its mass character, does not correspond to our initial assumptions." The words of the general of the German aviation had behind them and the actual confirmation. Only on the first day of the war the Luftwaffe lost up to 300 airplanes. Already on June 22, Soviet pilots began to use Ram German planes, which plunged the enemy into a real shock. Never before the Air Force of the Third Reich, the pride and hope of Adolf Hitler, commanded by the Führer's favorite Hermann Göring, had not suffered such impressive losses. The peculiarity of the country and the peculiarity of the character of the Russians gives the campaign a special specificity. This is the first serious opponent. Already in July 1941 recorded the commander of the land forces of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal General Walter von Brauchitsch, 60-year-old Brauchitsch, who had served for 40 years in the Prussian and German armies by the time the war with the Soviet Union began, understood the enemy. He had been through the First World War and had the opportunity to see how the armies of other European countries fight. Not for nothing in the German troops entered into common use of the saying, "Better 3 French campaigns than 1 Russian." And such a saying existed at the beginning of the war, and by its end, most soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht would safely compare 1 Russian campaign with 30 French or Polish. The second propaganda myth, in which Wehrmacht soldiers and officers were also disillusioned, asserted the allegedly low level of cultural development of the Soviet country. In fact, even then, even in the very early 1940s, the Soviet Union was already ahead of most countries in the world at the time in terms of educational development and outreach. In the 20 years after the revolution, the Soviet country managed to practically eliminate illiteracy, and an excellent system of higher education was created. Hoffmann, who commanded the 5th Company of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of one of the SS divisions, wrote, "At present, schooling in the USSR is at a high level. Free choice according to ability, without payment. I think that the internal construction of Russia was complete. The intelligentsia was created and educated in a purely communist spirit. In none of the countries of Eastern Europe, be it Poland or Czechoslovakia, let alone Romania or Bulgaria, could the education system at that time compare to the Soviet one, either in quality nor in accessibility." Of course, the most attentive and thinking German soldiers and officers noticed this circumstance and were imbued with respect, if not sympathy, for the country that managed to ensure the right of its citizens to receive not only school, but also higher education. Hitler's soldiers were surprised that many Russians they met in the occupied territories or among prisoners of war were better educated than even German commanders. They were equally surprised by the fact that even in rural schools of the Soviet Union the German language was taught. They met Russian people who could read German poets and writers in the original, play German composers' works on the piano, and understand German geography. And it was not about the nobility, who mostly left the country after the revolution, but about the most ordinary Soviet people, engineers, teachers, students, even schoolchildren. The German press painted the Soviet Union as a hopelessly technologically backward country, but Hitler's soldiers were confronted with the fact that the Russians had an excellent understanding of technology and were capable of fixing any breakdown. And it was not only in the natural ingenuity of the Russians, which the vigilant Germans also noticed, but also in the fact that the Soviet Union had a very high-quality system of both school and extracurricular education. Since there were so many people among the Germans, including members of the active army, who had been brought up in a religious, Christian spirit, Hitler's propaganda sought to portray the Soviet Union as a godless country in which the line of state atheism was hopelessly defeated. Of course, after the revolution, the Orthodox Church, like other traditional religions in Russia and other Union republics, was subjected to severe persecution. But a significant part of the population of the Soviet country remained deeply religious, especially if we talk about rural residents, about the older and middle generations of that time. And the Germans could not ignore this, and against Christians who prayed and celebrated Christian holidays, it was much more difficult to fight psychologically. The third myth is about the immorality of Russians, supposedly corrupted by the Soviet regime. This myth was also dispelled during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Thus, in Breslau at the film factory Wolfen, which used the labor of people stolen from Russia, a medical examination of girls under the age of 29 was conducted. It turned out that 90% of those examined were virgins. This result amazed the Germans, who never ceased to be amazed not only at the high morality of Russian girls, but also at the behavior of Russian men, who also shared this morality. It should be said that European countries, including Germany itself, could not boast such indicators. In fact, by the early 1940s, Europe was far more corrupt than the Soviet Union. The Germans were also struck by the deep kinship feelings that Russian people had for each other. Of course, German servicemen also sent letters home from the front, sent their photo cards and kept pictures of their wives, children and parents. But with the Russians, as German soldiers noted, correspondence with their home people was a real cult. Russian people were very much in need of maintaining kinship relations, taking care of their loved ones. And this fact also could not help but touch the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht. The longer the Germans were bogged down in the Russian campaign, the more difficult conditions they were in. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht fell into captivity, and there, in captivity, they encountered a shocking humane attitude on the part of both Red Army soldiers and peaceful Soviet citizens. It would seem that after the atrocities they had committed on Soviet soil, which, one way or another, most of the Wehrmacht soldiers were aware of anyway, the Soviet people should have mocked the prisoners. Cruel treatment did occur, but it was never widespread. In general, hardy Russians, especially women, felt sorry for German prisoners of war and even tried to help them in some way, often giving them food, clothing, and household items, which were far from superfluous in the harsh war years. Almost every German prisoner of war who visited the Soviet Union and left memories of years or months of captivity finds words to admire the Soviet people who did good-hearted deeds. Here, in distant and incomprehensible Russia, German soldiers and officers began to think about what is the very Russian soul that makes Soviet people show humanism and kind-heartedness to the invaders, executioners of the Soviet people.